She had no shoes, no name, and a black eye. But he gave her a new life. What if the person you were meant to save was the one who ended up saving you? What if a life, discarded like a stone in the desert, was the only thing that could make a hardened heart beat again? This is a story about a man who had buried his soul and a woman who had lost her name. He found her with nothing but bruises and the dust on her skin. But in giving her a future, he unknowingly reclaimed his own. The desert sun was a merciless god, beating down on Silas Blackwood's land with a white-hot fury that bleached the very colour from the rocks. For 5 years, that sun had been his only constant companion, its heat a familiar penance. His ranch, tucked into the unforgiving embrace of Scorpion Canyon, was a kingdom of silence and stone, a place where a man could forget he ever had a voice. He had come here to let the silence swallow his past, to let the memories of a woman's laugh and a child's cry bake into the dust until they were nothing but whispers on the wind. He was heading back from the well, the only reliable water in 20 miles, when he saw it, a flicker of colour against the drab ochre of the canyon floor. Not a cactus flower, not a lizard. It was cloth, a tattered piece of a blue dress, snagged on a shard of rock. His hand went to the pistol at his hip, a gesture as natural as breathing. Trouble didn't often find its way this deep into the canyon, but when it did, it came to kill. He moved with the quiet grace of a predator, his boots making no sound on the gravel. And then he saw her. She was lying face down, half hidden by a creosote bush, one arm flung out as if reaching for the water she couldn't see. Her feet were bare, cracked and bleeding. The dress was torn, and her dark hair was matted with dirt and something that looked like dried blood. He nudged her shoulder with the toe of his boot. Nothing. He knelt, his knees protesting, and rolled her over. The breath caught in his throat. Her face was a canvas of suffering. A deep purple bruise bloomed over her left eye, swelling it shut. Her lips were split and blistered, but she was breathing. A shallow, ragged flutter in her chest, like a trapped bird. His first instinct was to leave her. The desert was full of ghosts, and he had enough of his own. Bringing her back to his cabin was an invitation for whatever demons chased her to follow. But then her eyelids flickered. Her one good eye, a startling, clear grey like a winter sky, opened and tried to focus on him. No fear, no recognition, just a profound, bottomless exhaustion. He saw the faint white line on her ring finger, a ghost of a wedding band long since removed. This was someone's wife, someone's daughter, someone's trouble. He let out a long, slow breath, cursing himself, the desert, and the flicker of humanity he thought he'd successfully buried. He scooped her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, a bundle of dry bones and broken promises. As he carried her back toward the stone and timber cabin that had been his refuge and his prison, the sun beat down on his back, and the silence of the canyon seemed to watch him, waiting to see what he would do with this broken thing he had found. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. He only knew that leaving her to die would be a sin his already burdened soul couldn't bear. For the first time in 5 years, Silas Blackwood wasn't alone, and that terrified him more than any gunfight ever had. He laid her on his own bed. The first time anyone but him had touched the quilt his wife, Sarah, had stitched before the fever took her. The woman's skin was hot to the touch, a dry, burning heat that spoke of dehydration and infection. Her breathing was a shallow rasp. Silas moved with a methodical purpose that belied the turmoil in his gut. He fetched water, his hands, calloused and scarred from a life of hard work and harder fights, surprisingly gentle as he bathed the grime from her face. He cleaned the gash on her temple, a deep cut that had bled freely before the sun had baked it shut. He saw other bruises now, on her arms, her ribs, the faint, cruel outline of fingers on her neck. This wasn't the work of the desert. This was the work of a man. A cold, hard anger settled in his chest, an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long, long time. He forced a few drops of water between her cracked lips. She swallowed instinctively, a faint, guttural sound escaping her throat. He sat in the worn wooden chair beside the bed, his rifle across his lap, and watched her through the night. The cabin was filled with the sound of her breathing, a fragile rhythm that pushed back against the crushing silence he had cultivated for so long. He remembered another sickbed, another fever, another woman's life slipping away like sand through his fingers. He had been helpless then, and the memory was a fresh wound. He wouldn't be helpless this time. As dawn broke, painting the canyon walls in hues of soft rose and violent orange, her fever broke. The sweat beaded on her forehead, and her breathing deepened, losing its ragged edge. She stirred, her good eye fluttering open. This time, there was fear. She scrambled backward on the bed, pulling the quilt up to her chin, her gaze darting around the unfamiliar room, finally landing on him. He didn't move. He kept his voice low and steady, the way you would with a spooked horse. "You're safe here," he said. The words felt foreign on his tongue. She just stared, her one visible eye wide with terror. "Who are you?" Her voice was a dry croak, barely a whisper. "Silas." "Where am I?" "Scorpion Canyon. My cabin." She tried to sit up, winced, and fell back against the pillows. Her hand went to her head, her fingers exploring the bruised and swollen flesh around her eye. "What happened?" she whispered. "I don't know," he said. And it was the truth. "I found you by the well. You were—" He trailed off, not wanting to describe the state she'd been in. Her brow furrowed in concentration. She closed her good eye, and he could see the desperate search happening behind it. After a long moment, she looked at him again, and the fear in her eye was now mixed with a chilling new emotion. Panic. "I don't remember," she breathed, the words laced with dawning horror. "I don't remember anything. My name. I don't know my name." The silence that followed was heavier than any before. He was a man who had lost his past by choice. She was a woman who had had it stolen from her. He stood up and walked to the hearth, stirring the embers from the night before. He didn't know what to do with her tears, with the raw, terrifying emptiness in her eyes. So he did the only thing he knew how. He offered survival. "There's broth," he said, his back to her. "When you're ready, we'll figure out the rest later." Later. It was a word he hadn't used in 5 years. For him, there had only ever been now, the endless, punishing present. But now, with a nameless, broken woman in his bed, the future had just kicked down his door, and he had no choice but to let it in. The first few days were a quiet dance of caution and necessity. He called her Jane, a name as plain and unadorned as the landscape outside. She accepted it without comment, as if any name was better than the void she carried. She spent most of her time in the bed, sleeping the deep, healing sleep of the utterly exhausted. When she was awake, she watched him, her single grey eye tracking his every move with an unnerving intensity. She was like a wild thing, assessing a threat, deciding if the hand that offered food was the same one that would set a trap. Silas, for his part, treated her with a gruff, distant kindness. He left food and water by her bedside without a word. He restocked the fire. He sat on the porch in the evenings, cleaning his rifle, giving her the illusion of space in the small one-room cabin. He could feel her gaze on his back, a silent question he had no answer for. He was a man who had walled himself off from the world, and now the world, in the form of this broken woman, was sleeping in his bed. It was an intrusion, a violation of the sterile peace he had fought so hard to create. Yet he couldn't deny the change she brought. The silence in the cabin was different now. It was no longer the dead, hollow silence of grief. It was a silence that was alive, filled with the soft sound of another person's breathing. It was a silence that held weight and anticipation. On the fourth day, he found her standing by the small window, staring out at the sun-baked canyon. She was wearing one of his old, oversized shirts, which hung on her thin frame like a sack. The bruises on her face had begun to fade, shifting from a violent purple to a mottled yellow-green. She didn't turn when he entered. "There's nothing out there," she said, her voice stronger now. "Nothing but rock and heat." "There's life," he corrected, his voice raspy from disuse. "You just have to know where to look." He expected her to ask what he meant, but she didn't. She just nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Later that day, she ventured out of the cabin for the first time. She walked to the edge of the small, dusty patch he called a garden, where a few stubborn tomato plants and some herbs struggled against the relentless sun. She knelt, her fingers tracing the cracks in the dry earth. Silas watched from the doorway, his arms crossed over his chest. He saw the way she pulled a single tenacious weed from the base of a plant, her movements, slow but deliberate. It was a small act, almost insignificant, but it was the first sign of life he had seen from her that wasn't just about survival, it was about tending, about creating. The next morning, she was up before him. He woke to the smell of coffee, a scent that hadn't filled his cabin in 5 years. She was standing by the hearth, using his tin pot, her back to him. She had found the sack of beans in the pantry, ground them with the handle of a knife, and was now brewing a passable cup. He said nothing, just took the mug she offered. It was bitter and strong, just like he remembered. They drank in silence as the sun rose, casting long, sharp shadows across the canyon floor. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling heavy and awkward. She simply nodded, her gaze on the fire. In that shared, silent moment, something shifted. It wasn't trust, not yet. It was something more fragile. An acknowledgement. They were two broken people, trapped in a vast and indifferent wilderness. They had nothing in common but the scars they carried, seen and unseen. But for now, in the quiet of a new morning, that was enough. They were a man with no future and a woman with no past, and together they were facing today. Weeks bled into a month, and the raw edges of their cohabitation began to smooth. The woman he called Jane settled into the cabin's rhythm, like water finding its level. The fear in her eye was replaced by a quiet watchfulness, a deep-seated resilience that Silas found himself grudgingly admiring. She never spoke of the void where her memory should be, and he never asked. The past was a locked room they had both agreed not to enter. She became the keeper of the inside of the cabin, while he remained the master of the outside. She learned the quirks of his wood-burning stove, coaxing a steady heat from it that he never could. She mended the tears in his shirts with neat, almost invisible stitches, her fingers moving with a forgotten muscle memory. She even managed to coax a few more tomatoes from the pathetic garden, tending to the plants with a fierce devotion that seemed to puzzle even her. Her presence filled the empty spaces in his life, both literally and figuratively. The cabin no longer felt like a tomb, but a home, albeit a silent and strange one. One afternoon, he found her staring at the rifle that leaned against the wall. "You should know how to use it," he said, breaking the comfortable silence. Her head snapped up, a flicker of the old fear in her eye. "I don't like them." "Liking it has nothing to do with it," he said flatly. "Out here, there are things worse than a firearm. Snakes, coyotes, men." The last word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. He took her out into the canyon, the sun a hammer against their skulls. He set up a few empty tins on a rock ledge. He showed her how to hold the rifle, how to brace it against her shoulder, how to sight down the barrel. The weapon was heavy in her small hands, and she flinched when he stood behind her, his hands guiding hers into the correct position. His touch was impersonal, instructive, but it was the closest they had been. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the faint scent of leather and dust that clung to him. She fired. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, a brutal, shocking force. The shot went wide, kicking up dust 10 feet from the target. Again, he said, his voice impassive. She fired again, and again. Each time she flinched, each time she missed. Frustration tightened her jaw. "I can't," she said, lowering the rifle. "You can," he countered. "You're thinking too much. Stop trying to fight it. Just breathe. Squeeze, don't pull." He stood back, giving her space. She took a deep breath, the desert air scorching her lungs. She raised the rifle, nestled it into her shoulder, and remembered his words. "Squeeze, don't pull." She sighted the farthest tin, exhaled slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle echoed through the canyon, and the tin spun off the rock with a satisfying ping. A slow, surprised smile spread across her face. It was the first time he had seen her smile. It transformed her, chasing the shadows from her bruised features. For a fleeting moment, she wasn't a broken victim. She was just a woman, pleased with a newfound skill. He felt a strange, unfamiliar tightening in his chest. He turned away, busying himself with collecting the tins. "Not bad," he grunted, his back to her. "For a beginner." But as they walked back to the cabin, the setting sun casting their long shadows before them, he knew something had changed. He had given her a tool for survival, but she had given him something far more dangerous, a glimpse of the man he used to be, the man who could find pleasure in someone else's. Small victory. The walls he had built around his heart were still standing, but he could feel a crack forming, a thin fissure through which a dangerous light was beginning to shine. It had been nearly 3 months since he found her, and the thought of a supply run filled Silas with a new and unwelcome anxiety. The trip to the settlement of redemption was a 2-day ride, a journey he used to make with a sense of grim necessity. It was his only contact with the outside world, a place he despised but occasionally needed for flour, salt, and ammunition. Now, the thought of leaving the canyon, of leaving her alone, felt like a betrayal. A fragile domesticity had taken root in the barren soil of their lives. He had grown accustomed to the quiet rhythm of their days, to the scent of her baking bread mixing with the smell of gun oil, to the sight of her sitting by the fire in the evenings, her head bent over a piece of mending. He told himself it was just about her safety. She was still vulnerable, her memory a blank slate. But as he saddled his horse in the pre-dawn gloom, a deeper truth gnawed at him. He would miss her. He would miss the quiet, living presence that had filled the echoing emptiness of his home. "I'll be back in the 4 days," he said, standing at the cabin door. She stood there, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her grey eye serious. "The rifle is loaded. Don't open the door for anyone." She nodded. "Be careful, Silas." The simple words, spoken with genuine concern, settled in his chest with a surprising weight. He rode out of the canyon, not looking back. The journey to redemption was a descent into a world he had abandoned. The town was a festering sore on the face of the desert, a collection of ramshackle buildings filled with desperate prospectors, worn-out saloon girls, and opportunistic merchants. The air was thick with the smell of cheap whiskey and cheaper hope. He conducted his business with his usual curt efficiency, his eyes constantly scanning the street, his hand never far from his gun. He bought his supplies from the general store, ignoring the proprietor's prying questions. He picked up a month-old newspaper, not for the news, but for the familiar ritual of confirming the world was still as rotten as when he'd left it. He was about to leave when a posted notice on the wall of the assayer's office caught his eye. It was a formal declaration, printed in stark black letters. It announced the tragic death of one Ilara, beloved wife of Mr. Corbin Vance, a prominent figure from the silver-rich territories to the east. She had been, the notice read, lost to a tragic riding accident in the treacherous western canyons. A substantial reward was offered for the recovery of her body, for a proper Christian burial. Silas felt the blood drain from his face. Below the text was a charcoal sketch, a rendering of the deceased. It was crudely drawn, but there was no mistaking it. The high cheekbones, the determined chin, the clear, intelligent eyes. It was her. It was Jane. Her name was Ilara, and her husband, the man who had written this loving tribute, was offering a reward for her corpse. The cold anger from the day he'd found her returned, tenfold. This wasn't a grieving husband. This was a murderer tying up a loose end. A man so confident in his cruelty that he announced it to the world, cloaking it in the language of sorrow. He ripped the notice from the wall, the paper crinkling in his trembling hand. He was no longer just a man on a supply run. He was a man carrying a dangerous secret. He had a dead woman living in his cabin, and her husband, a wealthy and powerful man, wanted her found. The ride back to the canyon was a blur of dust and dread. The 4 days he had promised stretched into 5 as he pushed his horse, his mind a whirlwind of questions and fears. What would he tell her? Could he tell her? To reveal her name, her past, would be to resurrect the monster who had tried to destroy her. To keep it from her would be a lie, a cage of ignorance built around the fragile trust they had forged. For the first time, Silas understood that his quiet, isolated world had been irrevocably breached. The trouble he had feared from the beginning had not followed her into his canyon. It had been waiting for him, printed in black and white, in the heart of civilization. He was riding not toward his refuge, but toward a confrontation he didn't know how to win. He spurred his horse onward, the setting sun at his back, the stolen notice a hot brand in his saddlebag. He had to get back to her. He had to protect her. He just didn't know how. He returned to a cabin that felt different, charged with a new and fragile tension. A dust storm had blown in from the north, a furious, swirling wall of red dirt that blotted out the sun and screamed through the canyon like a banshee. He found Jane inside, the shutters bolted, a single lamp casting a flickering golden glow against the gloom. She had been waiting for him. She knew he was late, and the worry was plain on her face. "The storm," he said, by way of explanation, pulling the dust-caked bandana from his face. "I saw it coming," she said, her voice quiet. She took his saddlebags, her hands brushing his, and the simple contact sent a jolt through him. He was raw, his nerves frayed from the discovery in town. He felt a desperate urge to tell her everything, to show her the notice and share the heavy burden of the truth. But looking at her, at the tentative peace she had found in this small, protected world, the words died in his throat. How could he hand her back to the horror she had escaped? The storm raged outside, trapping them together. The wind howled, rattling the door in its frame and sending fine grains of sand seeping through the cracks in the walls. The world shrank to the 4 walls of the cabin, to the circle of lamplight that held them. He was unnaturally quiet, even for him. He unpacked his supplies with a heavy-handed clumsiness, his mind 1,000 miles away. Jane watched him, her brow furrowed. She had learned to read his silences, and this one was different. It wasn't the comfortable silence of shared solitude. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a secret. "What is it, Silas?" she finally asked, her voice cutting through the howl of the wind. What happened in town? He stopped, his back to her. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of profound weariness. Nothing. Just a long ride. You're lying, she said, her voice soft but unyielding. I may not remember who I am, but I know when a man is carrying a weight he can't set down. Talk to me. He turned to face her, his expression grim. The lamplight carved deep lines into his face, making him look older, harder. He reached into his coat, his hand hesitating for a moment before he pulled out the crumpled notice. He smoothed it out on the rough-hewn table between them. I found this, he said, his voice a low growl. Posted on the assayer's wall. She stepped closer, her eyes drawn to the charcoal sketch. She stared at it, her head tilted, a strange, blank recognition on her face. She traced the lines of the drawing with a trembling finger. Then she read the words. She read them once, then twice. Her face went pale, a stark, bloodless white beneath the fading bruises. Ilara, she whispered, the name a foreign sound on her lips. It was like watching a ghost see its own gravestone. My name is Ilara. He saw the flicker of memory in her eye, not a flood, but a spark in the darkness, a flash of a man's face, smiling, but with cold eyes, a flash of a heavy ring on a hand, the glint of silver, a flash of pain, sharp and blinding. She stumbled back from the table, her hand flying to her mouth, a choked sob escaping her. He said I fell, she whispered, the words coming in a torrent now, as fragments of her past broke through the dam of her amnesia. He said it was an accident, but I remember his hand, his ring. He was angry. She looked at Silas, her one good eye wide with a terror that was no longer nameless. It now had a face and a history. He left me. He thought I was dead. Silas's jaw tightened until it ached. He's offering a reward for your body, he said, his voice like stone. So he can bury his mistake. The wind shrieked outside, a perfect echo of the storm that had just broken inside the cabin. The secret was out, and it was worse than he could have imagined. She wasn't just a woman who had been beaten and discarded. She was a woman who was being hunted by a man who wanted to ensure she stayed dead. He'll come looking, she breathed, her voice shaking. If he finds out I'm alive, he'll come here. Let him come, Silas said, the words a low, deadly promise. He crossed the room and stood before her, not close enough to touch, but close enough for her to feel the unyielding certainty radiating from him. This is my home. You are under my protection. He will not touch you again. In that moment, he was no longer just a man offering shelter. He was a shield, a guardian. And the quiet, broken woman before him was no longer just Jane. She was Ilara. And her war was now his. The revelation of her name, Ilara, acted as a key, unlocking small, painful fragments of her past. The memories came not in a flood, but in sharp, jagged shards that pierced the fog of her amnesia. She would be kneading dough and suddenly remember the feel of a cold, marble countertop beneath her fingers. She would hear a bird call, and a flash of a lavish garden would fill her mind's eye, a place of beauty. That somehow felt threatening. And always there was the man's face, Corbin, her husband. She remembered his charm, the public face he showed the world, a mask of affluence and generosity. But behind it, she remembered the coldness in his eyes, the biting cruelty of his words when they were alone, his rage when she had failed to produce an heir. The last memory was the sharpest. An argument near the canyons. He had discovered she had found his ledgers, the ones that detailed his fraudulent silver claims, the ones that proved he had ruined other men, even driven one to his death. That was why he had struck her, not in a fit of pique, but with the cold, calculated intent to kill. He had hit her with a rock, the same one she had seen him admire for its smoothness just moments before, and had rolled her into a shallow ravine, believing the fall and the desert would finish the job. With the memories came a new kind of fear. It was no longer the formless terror of the unknown, but the specific, gut-wrenching fear of a man she knew was ruthless and would stop at nothing to protect his secrets. "He'll find me," she said one evening, her voice a tight whisper as she stared into the crackling fire. "A man like that doesn't leave things to chance." "Then we'll be ready for him," Silas replied. He was cleaning the rifle, his movements economical and precise. The quiet domesticity of their lives had vanished, replaced by a tense, focused state of preparation. The cabin was no longer just a home, it was a fortress. Silas spent his days reinforcing it. He checked the shutters, strengthened the door, and cleared the brush around the cabin to eliminate any potential cover. He showed Alara the hidden caches of water and ammunition he had stashed throughout the canyon. Contingencies for a siege he had always subconsciously expected. His tutelage with the rifle took on a new urgency. "Don't aim for the man," he instructed, his voice hard. "Aim for the space where he will be. Anticipate. The desert taught me that. Everything out here is either predator or prey. You have to decide which one you are." Alara learned quickly. The fear that had once made her flinch was now channeled into a cold, hard focus. The rifle felt different in her hands now. It was no longer a symbol of violence she abhorred, but a tool of survival, an extension of her will to live. In the crucible of their shared purpose, the space between them shrank. The unspoken attraction that had simmered beneath the surface now bloomed in the stark clarity of their situation. One evening, after a long day of practice, she found him on the porch, staring out at the blood-red sunset. His face was a mask of grim determination, but she could see the exhaustion in the slump of his shoulders. She came and stood beside him, their shoulders almost touching. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. "This isn't your fight." He turned to look at her, his gaze intense. "The day I carried you into my cabin, it became my fight." He reached out, his callous thumb gently tracing the faded line of the bruise beneath her eye. It was a gesture of such unexpected tenderness that it made her breath catch. "He hurt you," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. "No man has the right to do that. He will kill you to get to me. He can try." The simple, declarative statement held more power than any boast. In his eyes, she saw not just a protector, but a man who understood suffering, a man who, like her, had been broken by the world and had somehow pieced himself back together. She saw a reflection of her own strength, her own will to endure. Without thinking, she leaned in and pressed her lips to his. It was a kiss born not of passion, but of gratitude, of recognition. It was chaste and brief, but it was a tectonic shift in the landscape of their relationship. He didn't pull away. He didn't deepen the kiss. He simply stood there, his hand still cupping her face, a look of profound surprise in his eyes. When she pulled back, the air between them crackled with everything they hadn't said. "I'm not Sarah," she whispered, naming his ghost for the first time. He had told her about his wife one night, a rare crack in his stoic facade. "I know," he said, his voice hoarse, "and I'm not the man who lost her anymore." The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the canyon into a deep, velvety darkness. The threat of Corbin was a shadow looming over them, but for the first time, Alara didn't feel afraid. She was standing beside a man who had seen the worst of her, the worst of the world, and had not turned away. He had given her a name, a home, and a reason to fight, and she, in turn, had given him something he thought he'd lost forever, something to fight for. The waiting was a torment. Every dust devil on the horizon looked like an approaching rider. Every snap of a twig in the night sounded like a footstep. Days turned into a week, and the tension in the cabin became a living entity, a third presence at their table. They moved in a state of hypervigilance, their conversations clipped and practical, their senses honed to a razor's edge. But beneath the tension, their new intimacy was a quiet, steady flame. They moved around each other with a new awareness, a shared glance across the room now holding a novel's worth of meaning. The stark lines of protector and protected had blurred into a partnership, forged in shared vulnerability and sealed with a kiss. Then, one blistering afternoon, they came. Silas saw them first, from his vantage point on the ridge above the cabin. 2 riders, moving slowly, deliberately, their figures shimmering in the heat haze. One was a large man on a fine black horse, his posture arrogant even from a distance. Corbin. The other was slighter, a wiry figure who rode with the slouch of a hired gun. Silas scrambled back down the rocks, his heart a cold knot in his stomach. "They're here," he said, entering the cabin. Ilara was by the hearth, her face pale but composed. She nodded once, picked up her rifle, and took her position by the side window, the place they had designated. The plan was set. They waited. The hoofbeats grew louder, a slow, menacing drumbeat announcing their arrival. The 2 riders pulled up 20 yards from the cabin. Corbin Vance swung down from his horse, with the easy confidence of a man who believed the world belonged to him. He was handsome in a cruel, polished way, his clothes too fine for the desert, his face a mask of condescending pity. He stopped at the edge of the porch, his eyes scanning the simple cabin with disdain. "Ilara, my dear," he called out, his voice smooth and cultured, a grotesque parody of affection. "I know you're in there. I've come to take you home. This foolishness has gone on long enough." The cabin door creaked open, and Silas stepped out, his rifle held loosely at his side. He stood on the porch blocking the doorway, a silent, immovable obstacle. Corbin's eyes narrowed, taking in Silas's worn clothes, his scarred hands, the quiet deadliness in his posture. "And who might you be?" Corbin sneered. "The local welcome party." "She's not going with you," Silas said, his voice flat and cold. Corbin chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "I see. You're her rescuer, her rustic champion. How touching. But this is a private matter between a husband and his wayward, confused wife. So I suggest you step aside before you get hurt." "The only one confused here is you," Silas retorted. "You seem to think you're walking out of this canyon." The hired gun shifted in his saddle, his hand drifting toward his pistol. Silas's eyes flicked to him for a fraction of a second, a silent warning that was as clear as a gunshot. From inside the cabin, Ilara's voice rang out, clear and steady. "I am not confused, Corbin, and I am not wayward. I remember everything." Corbin's mask of civility cracked, his face hardened, the charm evaporating to reveal the raw ugliness beneath. He took a step toward the porch. "You remember nothing, you foolish girl. You fell. Your mind is addled." "I remember your ring," Ilara called out, her voice gaining strength. "I remember the ledgers. I remember you leaving me to die." Corbin stopped dead. The pretense was over. His eyes, cold and reptilian, locked onto Silas. "You should have left her where you found her," he hissed. "She was a loose end. Now, you're one too." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to the man on the horse. The hired gun's hand blurred as he drew his pistol, but he was too slow. Silas's rifle was already at his shoulder. The shot was a single, deafening crack that echoed off the canyon walls. The hired gun jerked in the saddle, a look of stunned surprise on his face, before toppling sideways into the dust. Corbin stared, his mouth agape, the sheer speed and finality of the act momentarily paralyzing him. He had underestimated the quiet man in front of him. He had mistaken solitude for weakness. It was a fatal mistake. With a snarl of fury, Corbin drew his own ornate pistol and lunged for the cover of the water trough, firing wildly toward the porch. The battle for Scorpion Canyon had begun. The exchange of gunfire was brutal and swift. Corbin was a decent shot, but he was panicked, his bullets chewing up the wood of the porch railing, while Silas remained a study in deadly calm. Every one of Silas's movements was deliberate, conserving energy, making each shot count. He used the porch posts for cover, moving between them, presenting a constantly shifting target. Inside, Elara fought to control the tremor in her hands. She could hear the bullets thudding into the cabin walls, the splintering of wood, the roar of Silas's rifle. Her fear was a living thing, a cold knot in her stomach, but his voice calling out her name cut through it. "Elara! The side window! Now!" It was the plan. Corbin was so focused on Silas at the front that he had forgotten about her. She moved to the window, the one that overlooked the water trough. She rested her rifle on the sill, just as Silas had taught her. She could see Corbin, crouched behind the trough, reloading his pistol. His face was contorted in a mask of rage and frustration. This was the man who had tried to erase her, to silence her, to bury her in the anonymous dust. He was a monster, but right now he was just a man, exposed and vulnerable. Breathe, squeeze, don't pull. She took a deep breath, lined up the shot, and squeezed the trigger. Her bullet didn't hit him. It hit the stone of the trough just inches from his head, sending a spray of rock fragments into his face. He cried out, more in surprise than pain, dropping his pistol as he clutched at his eyes. It was the opening Silas needed. He vaulted over the porch railing, closing the distance between them in 3 long strides. He kicked the pistol away from Corbin's reach and hauled him to his feet, slamming him against the side of the trough. Corbin, temporarily blinded, flailed wildly. "You'll hang for this!" he spat, blood and dust mixing on his lips. "He was a bounty hunter with a legal warrant," Silas said, his voice dangerously low. "For a woman you reported dead. You came here to murder her. That's how the sheriff will see it." Elara stepped out of the cabin, her rifle held steady. She walked toward them, her step sure, her gaze locked on her husband. The fear was gone, burned away by the cleansing fire of the confrontation. She was no longer his victim. "It's over, Corbin," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "Your lies are buried." Corbin's eyes, now clearing, widened as he saw her. He saw the strength in her stance, the resolve in her face. He saw the woman he had tried to destroy, reborn and unbroken, and in that moment he knew he was defeated. Silas bound his hands with a length of rope from his saddle. He dragged the body of the hired gun away from the house, covering it with a canvas sheet. The silence that descended on the canyon was profound, broken only by the buzzing of flies and Corbin's low, ragged breathing. Elara stood watching, the rifle still in her hands. She looked at Silas, at the quiet, capable man who had faced death for her. He met her gaze, and in the space of that look, everything was said. The gratitude, the respect, the deep, unspoken love that had grown between them in the shadow of violence. The fight was over. The monster was caged. They were alive, and they were together. The next day, Silas rode to redemption, leaving Elara to guard their prisoner. Corbin, humbled and broken, was a different man without his power and his weapons. When Silas returned, he was not alone. The town sheriff, a weary but honest man named Miller, rode with him. Sheriff Miller listened to their story, his eyes moving from Elara's stoic face to Silas's grim one, to the bound and sneering Corbin. He looked at the notice Silas had taken from the wall, and at the ledgers Elara had told them were hidden at Corbin's eastern estate. "A man who reports his wife dead and then rides 200 miles to kill her again doesn't have much of a case for self-defense," Miller said dryly. He took Corbin into custody, along with the body of the hired gun. "You two might have to come in to give a formal statement," the sheriff said as he prepared to leave. He looked around at the isolated, sun-scorched cabin. "Or I could just write in my report that Vance and his partner got lost in the canyon. It happens." He tipped his hat. This place has a way of swallowing up bad men. With the departure of the law, a profound peace settled over the canyon. The threat that had loomed over them was gone, leaving a vacuum that was quickly filled by the quiet reality of their new life. That evening, they sat on the porch, the air cool and sweet after the heat of the day. The sky was a riot of stars, more than Ilara had ever seen. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence was no longer tense or cautious. It was deep, comfortable, and complete. "Thank you, Silas," Ilara finally whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He turned to her, his profile stark against the starlight. "For what?" "For everything. For seeing me when I was invisible. For giving me a place to heal. For fighting for me." "I fought for us," he corrected softly. He reached out and took her hand, his rough, calloused fingers lacing through hers. It felt right, natural, as if they had been made to fit together. "Ilara," he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "I buried my heart in this canyon 5 years ago. I never thought it would beat again. But then I found you. You brought life back to this place. You brought it back to me." Tears welled in her eyes, shimmering in the starlight. "I had nothing," she said. "No name, no past, no future. You gave me all 3. He squeezed her hand. "I don't have much to offer. Just this land, this quiet, this life." He looked into her eyes, his own shining with a raw, vulnerable emotion she had never seen before. "But it's yours if you'll have it. I'm yours if you'll have me." She didn't need to speak. She leaned in, and this time, the kiss was not one of gratitude, but of deep, resonant love. It was a kiss of beginnings, of promises, of 2 broken souls finding wholeness in each other. Spring came to Scorpion Canyon, and for the first time in years, it felt like a rebirth. The rains had been gentle, and a surprising carpet of wildflowers bloomed across the canyon floor, defiant splashes of purple and gold against the red rock. Silas and Ilara were married by a traveling preacher, a simple ceremony on the porch of the cabin with the desert as their witness. Word had come from Redemption that Corbin Vance, faced with overwhelming evidence of fraud and the attempted murder of his wife, had taken his own life in his jail cell. The shadows of the past were finally truly gone. Their life took on a new, joyful rhythm. Ilara's garden thrived under her care, producing enough vegetables to last them through the year. Silas found himself smiling more, the hard lines around his eyes softening. The sound of her laughter echoing in the cabin became his favorite sound. A year later, that sound was joined by a new one. The cry of their own child. A son with Silas's dark hair and Ilara's clear grey eyes. They named him Samuel, after Silas's father. Holding his son in his arms, feeling the tiny, fierce grip of his fingers, Silas felt the last of his old wounds finally begin to heal. The ranch grew. They acquired more land, more livestock. The cabin was expanded, a new room built for the baby, but the heart of their home remained the same small stone and timber structure where a man with no hope had saved a woman with no name. They had found more than just survival in Scorpion Canyon. They had found redemption. They had built a family, not on a foundation of shared blood, but on the far stronger bedrock of shared experience, mutual respect, and a love that had bloomed in the most desolate of places. One evening, years later, Silas stood with Ilara on the porch, watching their young son chase fireflies in the twilight. The world beyond the canyon still churned with its greed and its violence. But here, in their small pocket of peace, they were safe. They were whole. Alara leaned her head on his shoulder. "Do you ever think about that day?" she asked softly. "The day you found me?" "Every day," he said, his arm tightening around her. "It was the day my life began again." She smiled, a look of serene contentment on her face. The woman with no shoes, no name, and a black eye was long gone. In her place stood a wife, a mother, a survivor who had not only reclaimed her life, but had built a new one, a better one. And the man who had given it to her knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that she had given him back his own. What does it take to truly see another person? Is it looking past the scars, the bruises, the dirt, to the soul beneath? Silas saw Alara when the world had discarded her. Tell us about a time you felt seen, or a time you truly saw someone else. Your stories of connection and compassion remind us all that sometimes the greatest treasures are found in the most broken of places. Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe, because the next story is just over the ridge, waiting to be told.